Once again, I'm so glad that you're here with us in worship, and I want to dive right into the message this morning. Recently, I was having a conversation with a couple of young mothers, and one of them was sharing that her oldest son, is going to start kindergarten this upcoming fall, and all of the excitement and anxiety and all of the stuff that goes with that. But she said most especially what she wonders about or is worried about right now is whether there will be that back to school or first time going to school kindergarten roundup chance to meet the teacher because her son will be in a new building. It'll be a completely new experience. So she's hoping that she gets that chance. But of course, we know for many people that didn't happen last year because of COVID and all that. So she was beginning to wonder and ask those questions and feel that sort of anxiousness around that. When I was younger, I used to think that it was only kids that got anxious at that meet the teacher time. Do you remember that? I know when I was a student, particularly in elementary school, I would think very carefully about what clothes I was going to wear and what image I wanted to sort of share with the new teacher that I was going to have and all that. There's a lot that's bound up into that first sort of experience when you get to meet the teacher for the first time. Do you have any memories like that? Or maybe it's from junior high or high school. Things begin to change a little bit. Then you would find your schedule and you would, perhaps there would be one or two teachers on the list that you said, oh, I have that teacher. And that teacher could be a very good thing or not so much. Maybe that teacher was really, really tough and they had a reputation for that. Or maybe that teacher was really, really easy. Maybe that teacher was really strict or that teacher was really fun. Maybe that teacher was really good at their subject or that teacher sort of seemed checked out. Do you have that sort of memory? And so you would go into the class, you would begin the first day of school that next year, and you would walk in with all of these preconceived notions. Did you have that experience? I'm curious if you did when you met the teacher, when you got to know them, did your expectations prove true or were you surprised? In my life, I've got experiences of both, but I've been thinking about that idea of meeting the teachers and what comes with that because of our scripture today. So Paul, for his sake, is most definitely a teacher. And part of why we're spending all this time in Romans throughout this spring is because Romans is a good way for us to get to know Paul as a teacher. And I've tried to and will continue to try to introduce some of Paul's background so that we can understand more of what he brings to the table and what he's trying to teach us. And all of that is important. But today, we get to meet a different teacher. Today, we get to meet a teacher with a different sort of message. And we get an introduction to another missionary movement that's happening at the same time, really to Paul's competition. So I've said this already, we will refer to them simply as the teacher or the teachers. And they don't have a specific personality, though they have a specific message. And today we get to hear from their voice. And what we find is that they're similar to Paul, but they're also a little bit different. They have the same idea that people need to come follow Jesus, but they have a different idea of what that looks like. For them, it requires also being faithful to the Jewish law, to the Torah, to what we would call the Old Testament law. And it's a both and. You follow Jesus and you do this, and that's how you're faithful. And so we get all throughout Paul's writings and through Romans, we get this sort of clash, this competition between them. But I want to be clear about a couple of things. I don't think these are bad people. And sometimes they get a bad rap, probably especially if you read Galatians. Paul can be pretty aggressive towards them. But I do think they're misguided. I don't agree with their message, but I don't think they're bad. I don't think they're out to harm people. And so I think it's good to keep a little compassion in mind as we go through this. That idea of being misguided, that's what Christian history would say as well about them. Their message doesn't ultimately prevail. We don't have their message in their words documented. We have Paul's message in many words documented. documented, and we carry it around in our Bibles. And so it's important for us to have this caveat, to be gracious and respectful as we begin to get a clearer picture from Paul himself about who they are. Because again, Paul is a rival, and for him, this is a very important ministry and message, so at times he'll be pretty aggressive about it. The second thing that we need to remember in this is that history is always written by who? By the victors. And as the Christian faith, as Paul and this teacher or teachers are sort of writing and doing ministry and planting churches, the Christian faith as a whole is still in its infancy. It's in its bassinet. It hasn't had gospels written out, 4 of them, and put into a Bible and said, these are the stories about Jesus. In fact, it's likely that none of them have been written down yet. So these letters are being written as some of the very earliest parts of our Christian history. And so again, Paul's message will prevail, and Christian history will sort of relegate this other message to a background place. And that's okay. I just think we don't need to vilify them in that process while we do that. So the teacher's mission is trying to gain converts to follow Jesus and the Torah. And that's why we said this a couple weeks ago. That's why we'll encounter circumcision here in chapter 2 in the reading in a couple of weeks, because that's sort of a central sign of following the law, the Jewish law, the Torah. And so we'll encounter that. But that's the tension that we're running into. And so with all of that in mind, let's meet the teacher. Paul is going to give 14 verses to the voice of the teacher, and he's going to sort of lay out the teacher's argument. And then in chapter 2, which will begin next week, he'll have an imaginary dialogue with the teacher. It's a didactic, Socratic argument that's happening. But for this morning, I just want to focus on chapter 1, 18 through 32. And honestly, I'm going to cut out some of the middle of that just for length, to make it a little bit shorter. So this is verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness for those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through things that God has made. So they're without excuse. For though they know God, they did not honor God or give thanks to God, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. Therefore, God gave them up in their lusts, to the lusts in their hearts, and to their impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves. And then we'll jump down to 28. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to debased minds and to the things that should not be done. They were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetous, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They're gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious towards their parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. They know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die. Yet they not only do them, but they applaud others who practice them. Woo, that's a lot right there. So as we continue in Paul's symphony of Romans, I want to speak a bit about how it would have been heard by its first audience. In its first audience, this letter wouldn't have been stood up and read in church, and it wouldn't even have been sort of read in homes, but it would have been performed in house churches around Rome. So we have sort of not a real good guess about how many Christians there are in Rome at the time, but we know it's a pretty small number in a city of over 1 million people, and that they would have gathered in small house churches. They weren't necessarily underground because they weren't necessarily under persecution from the Roman government, but it wasn't certainly the mainstream group to be in. So they would gather in these house churches, and what would happen is that Paul sent messengers with the letter, and they would come and they would perform it. Again, not just read it, they would perform it. They would use voice and inflection and syntax and pause and all of the skills that they have as friends of Paul, and likely people who also knew folks in the Roman church to try to convey all of the punch that Paul packs into his words. And so they would sort of present this to them as a performance. And it was a sort of an honor to carry that message and to share it. And they would go from house church to house church performing this, that the audience might hear it. Now, that's a beautiful aspect of Scripture if we understand that and if we can begin to uncover some of the voice behind it. But oftentimes, because of this voice or because something else in the Scriptures, it's hard for us to understand what's going on, and we begin to wonder, how are we supposed to understand this? Or perhaps you hear me or some other church person say something and you're like, how am I supposed to get that out of what's written in the Scripture? Or maybe you say, it's great that the first audience would have had people read it in a performative manner with subtlety and vibrato, but what about us? And friends, I don't have a good answer to that except to say that this is one of the things that both frustrates me and intrigues me about this work, this theological work about understanding the Scriptures. What intrigues me is that there's always more growing to do in our faith together. There's always more that we can understand about what's written in here and the encounters that people have. What frustrates me is, well, the same thing. There's always more. But I think if we're gracious with ourselves, we can continue to grow in a way that brings life and energy to us. So maybe you think today, Kyle, how do we know that Paul is speaking in a different voice here? That this isn't Paul's words, but these are the words of the teacher, the rival teacher. And that's a good question. Truth be told, there's a lot of different strands that come together that sort of weave that picture. But one of the most important ones is what that reading that we just read, verse 18, what it kicks off with. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. Now, here's what I mean. I want us to remember where we were at the last 2 weeks when we were reading Paul's thesis statement. This is what he said, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation for everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faithfulness for faithfulness, as it is written, the righteous one will live by my faithfulness." Now, there is a marked shift in tone there. And I hope that you can perceive that as you read it or as you hear it. But let me tell you, if you were dissecting the Greek, it would become all the more clear in the original language that this was written in. The syntax, the diction, the flow, all of it has changed dramatically. And so too has the subject changed. In just one verse, very abruptly, it goes from one idea to the next. And that sort of second idea about the wrath of God will continue to be the focus for the next 14 chapters through the end of, 14 verses through the end of chapter 1. And so there's this big shift that happens. And I want to give you another example from our reading on the whole. Throughout this passage, there is this a list of sins that's presented, what one commentator calls a virtual Oxford Dictionary of Vice. And it should grab anyone's attention. In fact, there is also this poetic cadence that's written into this, that's sort of a drum beat through that whole reading if we were to read all of it. And it's of Greek words that begin with the a prefix, meaning the opposite. So when we say like apolitical, we mean somebody's not political. Atypical, someone's not typical. Atheist, not having faith. Apathy, not having concern or emotional investment. That's what I'm talking about, the prefix A. And so this gets translated in different ways, but if you can sort of see it all laid out, it definitely jumps out to things like this: senseless, shameless, worthless, faithless, heartless, ruthless, disobedient, inexcusable, ungodliness, wickedness, impurity, degradation, degrading passions, all that. And it just goes, that's 14 verses, and it just goes through there. There's another thing that would catch our attention in the original language. There is this building indictment of people, and it's like this: they are without excuse. They do not honor God as God. They became futile in their thinking. Their senseless minds were darkened. always a good pick-me-up. They became fools. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie. They were consumed with passion. They didn't see fit to acknowledge God. They were filled with every kind of wickedness and so on. And what's clear from this list of criticism is a few things. Number one, it's meant to be a really biting set of statements. And number two, there's a lot of finger wagging. Notice who it's wagging at. Who's the finger pointed at? They. But who's they? They are the ones who have not acknowledged the God of the cosmos. What may be less clear about that, that's all sort of clearly in the text. What may be less clear is what this list is sort of pointing at subtly. You know how sometimes in our culture we say things, but we're really pointing at something different? Well, this is sort of a laundry list of grievances that people of faith, particularly people who followed the God of Israel, had about the Gentiles, the pagans, the sinners, the people that Paul is called to evangelize and to convert. And so in the midst of this tone shift, one of the things that's clear is that there's this pretty negative connotation about the Gentiles. But these Romans were Gentile converts. That used to be them. And earlier in the letter, Paul was bragging about these people. He was bragging about all of God's beloved in Rome who are called to be saints. He was sending them grace and peace and congratulating them on their faith that's proclaimed throughout the world and hoping that their faith might encourage him and that he's been longing to see them. So you have that in the first 17 verses, and then this finger wagging and this list that would sort of be meant to conjure up a sense of revulsion. You see, it doesn't make much sense. Attacking the Roman church's neighbors and family members is not an endearing look for Paul, and it doesn't follow well with his tone that he's had up to this point. So there is this tone shift. And if you notice, there was also a shift in who he was addressing from you all in Rome to all of a sudden they. And as I said earlier, the subject changed. Because in Paul's thesis statement in verses 16 and 17, Paul said that this was about the righteousness of God that has been revealed in the gospel. But then in today's reading, in the teacher's voice, in the teacher's presentation, there's a different starting place. The wrath of God is revealed. And the wrath of God is for you people over there. So today we're talking about meeting the teacher, and that's the first piece that I want you to have to be able to hold on to, is that there's a tone shift and there's a different starting place. And we could sort of keep going on with this and sort of unpack it, and we'll do that over the next few weeks, but I want to jump to a different topic. I don't want to spend too much time here. I just want to make this offer. If you want to bat around some ideas about this, ask questions about it, if you want to sort of talk through like specifically over the first 3 chapters, who's speaking where, I want to encourage you one more time to come to that or log in to Zoom for that virtual coffee talk that happens on Thursday afternoons, 4 o'clock. I'm happy to unpack all of this, and we can do a little more dig-in Bible study on that if you want. Somebody said the other day, it feels like she had read the whole Romans all the way through at the beginning of the series. And she said, it feels like Paul really contradicts himself a lot. And he does, because he's speaking in multiple voices. He's literally having a Socratic argument with himself. And so if we don't understand that, he's directly contradicting himself. But if we do get the clearer picture and can pull back some of the layers on that, I think there's a really clear image that emerges. And so I want to help you with that, whether that's on Thursday afternoons or we need to find a different time to chat, reach out. I'd love to do that. So instead of spending more time there, I'm about to say a sentence that I never thought I would say, and certainly not in a sermon, and certainly not in a recorded sermon. I want to spend the rest of our time this morning talking about the wrath of God. Yeah, get excited. Because It's 2021 because there's no reason to be afraid anymore. I said that when we began this series. Because it's a central focus of what we're reading today, I want us to sort of engage in that idea, what that means, and is there some lesson for us to be had in that? So that's what I want to talk about. And like I said, this Romans journey would be challenging. It is for me as well. And again, this is all sort of uncharted territory for me. Paul uses that phrase, the wrath of God, more here than he does in all of his other writings combined. And in Romans, the word wrath is used 1/3 of the times that it's in the total New Testament. So clearly it's a theme that's going to keep popping up. So as they say, when in Romans, so let's talk about it. I want you to just do a self-check. When I say, let's talk about the wrath of God, what state does that put you in? Does it put you in a really relaxing state, like being on a beach and reading a book? But probably not. But again, let's be challenged. I want you to take inventory of that and hold on to that. And together, I want us to answer the question, what might the scriptures mean when they speak of God's wrath? And what might that mean for us? It's an important idea. It occurs throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's one that I think many people in our community have sort of wrestled to understand. Full disclosure, when that phrase comes up, the first picture I have is of God, most definitely as an old white man with a white beard, holding lightning bolts, riding on a cloud with a very angry face, yelling at something or nothing in particular. Maybe you have that same image. There's a picture, there's a painting that I'm thinking of. Maybe you have that as well. It may be Zeus or something, I don't know. But that's what comes to mind. What comes to mind for you? Maybe it has a more personal shape. Maybe the wrath of God is tied up in a voice from your childhood. Maybe it sounds like somebody with a megaphone screaming on a street corner. Maybe it sounds like something you've heard in a televangelist message about some way that you can escape that. Before we dismiss from this idea, before we shrink from it, I want to share a few ways that I've heard people talk about this in my study of Romans, preparing for this, that I think is helpful. And I owe a lot of this to a guy named Sigve Tonsted, who has done this research. So he talks about a few other theologian types, and they share things like this. A.T. Hansen understands the wrath of God to be something far less personal than I probably imagine it, and maybe you do. Rather than being delved out by a God who's angry at sinners, he thinks of wrath as something of more like natural consequence. When we make negative decisions, we're left with the result, and wrath then is not a punishment on top of that, it's just the natural result. Another way to say this might be to suggest that God, in designing the very fabric of creation, has woven into reality the existence of cause and effect. And so attributing negative effects to negative causes is sensible in that manner. Maybe that makes this idea a little bit more approachable if it feels unapproachable at first. Another theologian, Stephen Harris, talks about this intrinsic connection between our choices and wrath, but doesn't want it to be nearly as impersonal, because the beginning of the verse talks about this being revealed, which is a divine act, and the rest of the first chapter talks about this sort of wrestling back and forth, and it's always God who is ultimately sort of being slighted or wronged in the chapter. And so Harris wants to take it a step further and say that by observing everyday phenomenon, what others might call consequences, we as people of faith would see the workings of God in that. And so later in the chapter, when it says God has given them up, another may look at that as natural consequences, but to the believer, it's a predictable and avoidable pattern that God seeks to save us from. So those are a couple of things. Now, Tonsted himself, whose research I'm sharing, has a totally different view and thinks we're all making it too personal. It's all about the cosmic level. We'll see later that Paul is very convinced that God is in the business of liberating us from powers and principalities that oppress and dehumanize and destroy. And so, there are these hostile agents at work on the divine or the cosmic scale. And so he believes that perhaps God's wrath is reserved for that sort of level. Speaking of evil on the whole, not for individuals, but the way that oppression makes itself known in the world. It's God's way of taking what's disjointed and making it right. And maybe that's the case as well. I'm not telling you which of these to sort of hold on to. I just want us to think about this through a different lens, because it's a challenge, but it's something we're going to encounter. I want to close, though, with something that I found helpful in my wrestling of this. I want to lean on the work of N.T. Wright and then sort of expand on that a little bit. As we've said, we can easily observe that the world is disjointed. Things aren't as God intended. We don't live in relationship with ourselves, with other people, or with God as God has sort of imagined. There isn't a peaceable reality between all of God's children, which is sort of what we believe God wants for the world. And so we can recognize that, but there's been this conception that we have to tie up the idea of the wrath of God with a malevolent, sort of tyrannical despot that's hurling thunderbolts at people for arbitrary reasons. And so that was sort of maybe the ancient view. And then in the 20th century, 18th, 19th century, there was sort of a diversion from that. But then Wright says we encountered the 20th century. We encountered world wars and ethnic cleansing and apartheid and the Holocaust. And perhaps we began to see things differently. If God is indeed the creator and the lover of the world, and that's what God is in the business of, creating a world where all is right, then God should ultimately tolerate nothing less. So perhaps then, wrath is the attitude of hostility towards, not towards earth or humanity, but a way of naming God's relentless pursuit of evil that distorts and defaces creation. For N.T. Wright, Jesus is a central figure in that process. He says it this way: in one way or another, the fact of Jesus has drawn back the veil on the wrath that is to come. And that phrase had me up all night this week. Because if that's true, that's marvelous news. Because if Jesus is a picture or just a glimpse of what God's wrath looks like, then we have to rethink and I believe celebrate what this might mean, because this wrath isn't destructive, it's self-emptying. It isn't retributive, it's redemptive and liberating. It isn't a stick, it's an invitation to live a life that's truly life. And perhaps, if Wright is correct, Jesus is here also turning things on their heads like he does over and over. If this is the case, then perhaps wrath is one means by which God is making all things aright. And that's good news, but it's not good news that won't push us. Because if that's the case, then wrath will challenge and push us over and over again. It will refine us. And I have no doubt, friends, that we have things within us that need to be refined and made new, because I know me and I know other people. There are things around us that need to be cleaned up and challenged and made new. And that may be a painful process. That's why we need a God who has a sense of justice and equity and is in the business of making things right. We know that because we look at the world and we see that things are broken, and we look at ourselves and we know that we need healing. And that's not just in the last century. We look at our own dependence on power. You could define that by our military budget. You could define it by how many nuclear weapons are floating around the world that could end life over and over again. We have this dependence on power. We could look at our revering of markets and money, of the uneven distribution of wealth and wellness and food and power that results from all of that. We could look at the pursuit of beauty and the power of sex and the related dehumanization and degradation and disappointment that comes with that. We could name tribalism or nationalism that commands allegiance above all else and makes enemies of anybody who thinks or looks or behaves or believes or has different experience. And if we take a sober assessment of ourselves, we find our own participation in many of these or similar types of realities, and we'll find shards of it within our own hearts. And if we're honest, I think, then we know that we need something outside and beyond us at work setting things right, because we don't have the power within ourselves. And maybe God and God's wrath is the mechanism that we name that refining work, and yes, challenging, and yes, painful work of right-making that God is in the business of. Jesus' ministry will bring about life. He will announce freedom, but it won't always come without cost, and it won't always be comfortable. We have attachments that need breaking, remolding, and reshaping, and all that growth, like all growth, will come with growing pains. So maybe the wrath of God is how we say that God's opposed to the spiritual forces of wickedness and evil power in this world and sin, that God is rooting out injustice and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. And friends, we may be implicated in that, but we will not be consumed in that, because that's not a finger-wagging kind of indictment. And it's definitely not where I would begin telling the gospel, but it doesn't mean that there isn't something for us to learn here. And it doesn't mean there isn't something to do. That list that I just named, that's a part of our baptismal vows. That's part of what we say, that we'll participate with God in the uprooting of injustice and oppression and the opposition of spiritual forces of wickedness and evil power and sin in the world. That's part of what we agree to. So there's work for us to be done. Friends, I know that the idea of spending the last 20 minutes talking about the wrath of God probably isn't what you thought you were signing up for. But maybe, just maybe, if we look through the lens of Jesus as the beginning, what we might be able to see is where we get to continue that work. And maybe if we find in ourselves the things that need to be rooted out, we might find freedom. And maybe if we trust in God's goodness and righteousness, and from there move to the question of wrath, maybe, just maybe, there's something here for us to learn, and there's a journey for us to take, and there's growth for us to receive. So may it be for each one of us. Amen. Let's take a few moments for reflection.